Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Thank you, Dylan Thibert, for the super chat. It is deeply appreciated. Wow, before I even got started, I got a super chat from Dylan Thibert. Welcome, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you. These are good times. These are hard times, but as I've always tried to reassure all of you, we are very lucky to be living in these times. Revolutionaries of the past would kill to be in our shoes because there was not a revolution in the 1930s. There was not a revolution in the 1960s. But we are entering a period of the breakdown of American capitalism in which there very well could be a successful transition to a socialist society and the dismantling of American imperialism in our time. That is something that we should be optimistic about. It is darkest before dawn. Things get worse before they get better. Thank you, Zachary, for the super chat. And we should keep that in mind. We should center ourselves. Take a few minutes. I would urge you to take a few minutes every day and center yourself with that recognition that we are approaching the death agony of capitalism. We are approaching the end of this system, and it's happening, and we have to recognize that. And it's going to be difficult. These are going to be difficult years because this is how it has to be before things ultimately reach their conclusion. As Kinky says in the chat, it's going to be a painful transition, but we are entering a period in which things have the potential to actually change. Welcome, everybody. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Be sure to hit that notifications bell because if you hit that notifications bell, then you will, in theory, get notified every time we do one of these and not be left behind. So I wanted to just, we're going to do things the way we normally do them on here. I'm going to give my opening remarks. Then from there, we will have the roll call where I call you out as I see you, names and locations. And then from there, I answer your super chat questions. I have the pen, click, 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 click. I have the pen here in my hand, and as the super chats come in, I will write the super chat questions down. And in the second half of the show, I will do my best to give you a decent answer to those super chats. You send me a super chat, I will send you an answer. May not be the answer you want, but I will do my best to give you an answer, and I will do my best to give you a good answer, right? Because I feel like a super chat deserves a good answer. So I just wanted to mention that. And while we're here, I wanted to give a shout out to, wow, there's so many people I could give a shout out to, people that are doing great work. Shout out to all the workers on strike at John Deere, all the workers on strike at Kellogg's, all the nurses that are on strike. The debates socialists had and past socialist debates relevant. That's a good question. I want to give a shout out to those workers on strike. I want to urge people, if you are able to give support to striking workers and their families, especially those John Deere striking workers that are on the brink of losing their health care, that's an important thing to do. Also, I want to give a shout out to Alex Saab. I really doubt they give Alex Saab access to the internet where he's being held right now in Miami. But Alex Saab is being held. He's being held because of the fact. Stalin power. He's being held because of the fact that he worked to try and bring food to the people of Venezuela. He was on his way from Venezuela to Iran to arrange for food to be shipped from Iran to Venezuela. He's now being charged with aiding the housing program, with going around the world and enabling Venezuela to buy building supplies for their low-income housing project. And Alex Saab, in the very, 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 very slim chance that you are watching, I want you to know that you are in there for for us, and we are out there. We are out here for you, Alex. We are out here for you. You know, they have locked you up. They've kidnapped you from Cabo Verde. They've dragged you to Miami, the center of Latin American reaction, where all the Miami gusanos are, all the Escalitos from Venezuela are. They've got you held in some facility. People don't even know where you're being held in Miami. You're being held somewhere in Miami right now. You were already tortured in Cabo Verde. But outside of the prison, there are millions of people in the world who realize that you are being persecuted for doing the right thing. That you were grabbed because the Wall Street imperialists are determined to crush Venezuela's move toward socialism. They're angry that you got building supplies to help the Venezuelan government build low-income housing for the people. They're angry that you somehow enabled Venezuela supposedly to, get food to its population. They're persecuting you right now, and you're awaiting trial. But, outside, there are many people who realize who the real murderers are, who the real criminals are, who the real money launderers are, who the real mass murderers and gangsters really are. And, I really doubt you can hear us now, Alex, but if anyone who knows Alex is watching, they should also know that there are many of us out here who are on your side. And we realize that the way that they've grabbed you is a huge violation of international norms. It's a huge violation of diplomatic normalities. You should have had diplomatic immunity. And we are doing our best to raise awareness and not let them disappear you quietly, and to demand that they do the right thing and let you return to be with your family. So there you go. Wanted to just get that out of the way there and just make it clear. If you want to know all about the case, you can watch some of the videos or read some of the articles on cpiusa.org. You can go and watch the rally, the great demonstration that the John Brown volunteers put on, in Times Square on Sunday to support Alex Saab. And you can watch yesterday's stream. I talk about it in depth. We're trying to do everything we can to support Alex Saab. And if you can do something in your area to support Alex Saab, if you can put up posters in your area to support Alex Saab, if you can hand out leaflets in your area to support Alex Saab, that would be a great thing to do. If you can counter the propaganda and disinformation that they're using to try and justify this modern-day act of barbaric kidnapping, if you can counter the lies that they're using to justify what they've done to Alex Saab, that would be a good thing to do as well. Just like supporting those striking workers would be a good thing. But anyhow, folks, I actually wanted to use my opening remarks tonight. I was going to talk about Venezuela, and I am going to talk about Venezuela, but I'm going to use Venezuela to make a very important point. Because, sometimes on these streams, we come up with little concepts, little notions that we give names to, right? One thing we've talked about is the Harrington light switch, right? Michael Harrington, the founder of Democratic Socialists of America, he was notorious for using a logical fallacy that I've called the Harrington light switch. And it goes like this. The idea is that, ultra-left people that run around and talk about overthrowing the government and sell newspapers about Trotsky and burn the American flag are crazy. So therefore, we should all become Democrats and reformists. Michael Harrington was notorious. He builds this either-or situation. It's very true that the Marxist groups in the United States are disconnected from the broad masses of people. That's very true. It is very true that most of the communist sects in the United States don't have a broad following among the masses. That's true. However, what's not true is to then say, therefore, click, you need to be, this is Valentine Perez. You therefore need to be a reformist, right? And you need to, boil everything down to the most common denominator. You need to not question U.S. foreign policy. I call that the Harrington light switch. It is a deception. And we've come up with a couple other of these that we talk about on this stream. When there are deceptive or fallacious arguments that are commonly made, right? Michael Harrington, he's long dead, and he's not the only person to make this argument. We give them a label. And so I want to also label a new logical or fallacious argument, a new fallacious argument that I hear a lot from people who believe in socialism. And that argument we will call the Vosh Deception, or the Vosh Illusion. I think we'll call it the Vosh Illusion, right? Because I debated Vosh. We had our debate about tankies. And one thing that I said to Vosh that made him he just got angry when I said it, because he knows it's true. I said there will never be a socialism that the New York Times will approve of. And you should have seen his reaction to that. That just go look at the clip. And I said, there will never be a socialism that the New York Times will approve of. That made him very angry, because it's true. However, Vosh and others, they fall into this illusion, and this is a very, very common delusion that I hear among people who are socialists. And it's anti-tankies, anarchists, social democrats. They have it in their head that one day there's going to be a country somewhere. That one day in South America or Africa or Asia, there's going to be a country that adopts socialism. They adopt a socialist economic system. And the New York Times and NPR, National Public Radio, and Fox News and MSNBC are going to go, wow, we may not agree with their economic system, but this is an upstanding country. They are practicing socialism by the book. We don't agree with them, but they are a legitimate government. They're not violating human rights. They're democratic. They're pure. And the USA would be wrong to destabilize and overthrow it, because they're just so upstanding and democratic and pure, and we just have to respect it. And I swear, these people really do believe that someday, if Cuba were just pure and democratic enough, the Americans would not try to overthrow it, and the New York Times would not accuse it of violating human rights. They really do believe that if North Korea just allowed opposition parties, and if North Korea just had open elections and allowed opposition to have free speech, that the USA would go, by golly, well, we don't agree with them, but they're a good country. That will never happen. That will never happen. That will never happen. That will never happen. And the fact that you think it's going to happen is a very dangerous delusion. Venezuela is a great example of proof this will never happen. Hugo Chavez got elected in 1999, moved the country, they attempted to have a military coup against him before he'd even started moving the country towards socialism. After 2003, he started moving the country towards socialism, and immediately, it was all over U.S. media that Hugo Chavez was a brutal dictator. Hugo Chavez was a brutal dictator. Now, I've been to Venezuela. In Venezuela, the opposition has seats all across the parliament. They have ads on television. They have demonstrations against the government all the time. They practically bend over backwards to accommodate the opposition. Furthermore, Venezuela has a highly transparent election system. The Carter Center, run by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, said that Venezuela has one of the best and most transparent election systems in the world. But somehow, Venezuela is declared to be a brutal dictatorship. The whole world monitored those elections. The UN monitored them, the Carter Center, all these institutions. They said that Chavez was the winner of the elections. The opposition has ads on television. The opposition has candidates running for office. They have elected members of parliament. They have demonstrations in the streets. They have media outlets that support them. But somehow, Venezuela is a brutal dictatorship. Keep in mind, Venezuela does not have the death penalty. Did you know that? Venezuela doesn't even have the death penalty. But somehow, according to U.S. media, Venezuela is a brutal dictatorship. Why? Because it is. Because, and that's, if they can convince people that Venezuela is a brutal dictatorship, they can convince people that any country is a brutal dictatorship. The amount of freedom of speech, the amount of representation, the amount of electoral, participation and transparency and oversights. I'm sorry, Venezuela is not a dictatorship by any means. It is a very open society. It just so happens the people in this open society called Venezuela have voted for Hugo Chavez and Maduro, have voted for the United Socialist Party, and so the United States declares it to be a dictatorship. Why? Because, Evo Morales. Evo Morales, they said he was a dictator. Now, he won all the elections fair and square. He won all the elections fair and square. He was, very popular in the country. Opposition parties were everywhere. They had news outlets. And they still declared Evo Morales to be a dictator. Catch this one, Nicaragua. The Sandinistas, they led the revolution. Immediately, the USA began funding the Contras and imposing a civil war on Nicaragua. But then, in 1991, Nicaragua had an election. And the Sandinistas lost the election. And they stepped down from power. But yet, they were still dictators. They ran in the election. They had an election in 1991. They lost the election. But still, as they were leaving office, they were dictators. And then they got reelected in 2006, and they were dictators again. Daniel Ortega, he loses the election, and he's still a dictator. He gets back in 2006. He's a dictator. They have election after election in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas win by huge majorities because of the fact that they've raised, but, it's still a dictatorship. Why? Because it is. Right? Now, I don't pretend that North Korea has the same level of freedom we have in the United States. Of course they don't. Their country is locked down and still technically at war with the United States and facing huge sanctions. There's thousands of troops on their border. It's an authoritarian state. China is very authoritarian. Right? Vietnam, Cuba. These countries are fighting for their lives. And I'm not pretending that they have the same level of free speech. But if they did, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter. If they did, U.S. media would still call them evil, brutal dictatorships. And then if you want any proof of that, go look at Venezuela. Go look at Bolivia. Go look at Nicaragua. Right? They joked that Pedro Castillo, the day after he won the election, he was a dictator. Right? You cannot, there will never be a socialism the New York Times will approve of. And that's what Jabba the Vosh and all these anarchists don't understand. In their minds, if only Cuba would be more democratic and open, then the New York Times would just have to respect them. Wrong. It does not work that way. And if you can look at how blatantly they lie about Venezuela, how they say the elections are rigged when they ain't, how they claim that it's, this brutal authoritarian state when it doesn't even have the death penalty. Why should you believe what they say about China? Why should you believe what they say about Cuba? Why should you believe what they say about North Korea? Why? I'm sorry, if if you can look at Venezuela and Nicaragua and Bolivia and and if you can really look at the facts on the country, and then you compare what is said in US media about these countries, it will become very apparent to you that truth does not matter to US media. It does not matter. Right? Doesn't matter. As long as these countries are moving towards socialism, it's an authoritarian, brutal communist dictatorship. And that is how US media works. And that's what these folks don't understand. They really do believe that somehow there will be a socialism someday the New York Times will approve of, that NPR won't do hit pieces on, that they won't accuse of mass genocide and murder. They really do believe this. They really believe in their hearts that somehow there will be a socialist government that their university professors will tell them it's okay to like, that mainstream media will tell them it's okay to like, that they won't have to swim against the current, they won't have to stand up and question authority. That's what they believe. These people really do believe that somehow there can be a socialism that they won't have to get any flack for defending. There'll be an easy socialism. There'll be a socialism that'll emerge, and it'll really be socialism, but U.S. media won't call them tankies for defending it. U.S. media won't call it a dictatorship. They really do believe this. They believe this, that somehow there will someday be a socialist or a communist society that will somehow be actually socialist and not be accused of all kinds of bad things in mainstream media. And as long as they hold on to that illusion, they're useless. I'm just being real with you. As long as they hold on to that illusion, they're useless. Because at the end of the day, if you accept what the voice of our enemy says about Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, about China, about Vietnam, about Korea, if you accept what the enemy says, if you're constantly trying to prove and win credibility in the eyes of the enemy internationally, pretty soon you're going to do that domestically. Right? It applies domestically as well. Right? If you're going to let yourself be programmed and brainwashed by American media when it comes to international issues, you might as well be programmed and brainwashed when it comes to domestic issues. And they are. And they are. I mean, and we see that, right? I mean, it's, Trump is a neo-Nazi. We're all going to die unless Joe Biden wins. And, and if Joe Biden doesn't win, we're all going to be in death camps. And, Kamala Harris is the savior. And no, I mean, you listen to the bread tube narrative. They do accept what mainstream media says when it comes to U.S. domestic stuff. It's not too surprising. That's generally how this stuff works. It's okay. It's okay to question what mainstream media says. It's okay to disagree with your teachers and your college professors. It's okay. It is okay. It is okay. And if you can't do that, you ain't really a socialist. And that is what needs to be said. And as much as that's a hard pill to swallow, as much as that's something that some people just can't wrap their heads around. No. I mean, I'm a socialist, but Fidel is a dictator. Oh, I'm a socialist, but China is I'm sorry, but if you can't get over that hurdle, you have to take sides. There's a very good book, and it's a book by Vladimir Lenin, and it's a book that people generally don't read, right? The books that people read by Vladimir Lenin, they read The State and Revolution, they read What Is to Be Done, they read Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, they read Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. But there's a very important book that Vladimir Lenin wrote, and it's called Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. And if you look at that book, That book is all about how the Russian Revolution happened, and Karl Kautsky, the leader of German social democracy, declared that the Bolsheviks should not have taken power because it was not democratic. They should have been elected. They should not have taken power. They shouldn't have declared the Soviet government. They should have waited for a constituent assembly and won a majority of delegates in that constituent assembly, and with a democratic popular mandate composed a socialist constitution. Because the Bolsheviks instead declared the Soviets, the councils, to be the new government, declared a Soviet government, therefore they were not democratic. It was a dictatorship. And in that pamphlet, Lenin very blatantly lays out, first of all, that democracy is a lie. Right? Democracy is a lie. The military is sent in to crush striking workers. That the rich people write the laws and have the authority and use the media to deceive people, and that even the most democratic capitalist society is full of political repression to serve the capitalists, number one. And that true full democracy is only possible in a society in which there are no classes. As long as there are a small group of people who control the means of production, those small group of people are going to control the government. And so the hope for getting to true democracy is the hope of getting to socialism. And that every country in the world has a clause in its constitution that makes freedom go away. In the United States, you read our Constitution, yeah, we've got free speech, we've got freedom of religion, we've got freedom of assembly, unless Congress declares war, and then you don't. Did you know that? If there's a congressional declaration of war, yeah, all of our freedoms go away real fast if Congress declares war. You think during World War II, when Congress declared war on the Nazis, you could have a pro-Nazi demonstration? No! Because it was a state of war, and the U.S. Constitution made that clear. When they declare war, not when they invade, and they haven't had a congressional declaration of war since the Second World War. Right? It's all been police actions and interventions. But when they actually declare war in the United States, or when they actually declare a national emergency or martial law, under such circumstances, all your rights go away. Because it's an emergency, because the regime is under attack. The amount of freedom that you have in any society, is based on how safe the regime feels and how stable the country is, right? All right, Gaddafi on democracy. When the regime feels very safe, and when society is very stable, you tend to have a lot of freedom. You can say what you want because society is very stable. And when society is unstable, and when the regime is facing the threat of being overthrown, then you don't. That's generally how it works. Why is it that no one in the world ever talked about human rights and the rights of man and freedom of assembly and freedom of speech and natural rights? Why did no one talk about that until like the 1400s in Europe? Why? Is that because people were evil until then, and then suddenly, magically, with the birth of John Locke, they became good? Of course not. It's because this is based on a level of economic development. Try establishing a society with the modern level of freedom and democratic rights in feudalism, and the conditions of feudalism. In medieval Europe, in the Dark Ages, try saying, okay, everyone can think whatever they want, and everyone can just do whatever we want. We're going to elect the person who's in charge. It wouldn't work, because people are starving. When people are desperate, might is right prevails and all of that. The reason that they invented feudalism was not because people were just evil and there was somebody up there. And this is what anarchists think, and it's really childish. They think there was some guy up there who was just like, I don't want people to be free. Mwahaha, how can I oppress them? And it's like, no. In order for society to function at that level of development, with an agricultural economy, where you're farming, subsistence farming, basically, it was necessary for some people to be in charge of others. And it was necessary for people to believe that if they so much as questioned the religious authority, that they deserved to be burned at the stake, right? Freedom emerged when the level of economic development gave birth to a higher level of stability in society. And that higher level of stability in society enabled people to have more freedom. And that even applies to capitalist society. The level of freedom we have here in the United States has been increasing as the country has become more stable. Probably the height of freedom in the United States was the Warren Court of the U.S. Supreme Court, right? Under the Warren Court, there was a very famous court ruling. I don't know if people have ever heard of it. I learned about it when I was a university student. Brandenburg versus Ohio. Have you ever heard of Brandenburg versus Ohio? It was a very famous Supreme Court case. Charles Brandenburg, who was the leader of the Ohio Ku Klux Klan, bought time on TV to give a speech. And so Charles Brandenburg, with the time that he paid for, got on TV and he said, I don't know what he sounded like. He was from Ohio. I mean, we think of the Ku Klux Klan as being Southern hillbillies, but he said something that probably sounded like this. He said, I want people to go and take acts of revengeance against elected officials who voted for the Civil Rights Act. He was arrested for that. Now, if I were Charles Brandenburg's lawyer, I would have argued that revengeance is not a word in the English language, so that clearly wasn't a threat. But that's not what happened. Charles Brandenburg was convicted in Ohio for criminal syndicalism, right? So they convicted him of the law they used to persecute the IWW, the syndicalists, like the Wobblies. But they charged him with criminal syndicalism, advocating violence. And he was charged with advocating political violence on television because he called for acts of revengeance against elected officials who supported the Civil Rights Act. So Charles Brandenburg, I think he had the ACLU backing him up. They went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that because Charles Brandenburg did not call for a specific criminal act, he did not specify what he wanted done, he didn't name a specific victim, he just gave this vague concept of revengeance, that was elected speech. And, I mean, I don't know any country in the world that's had that level of freedom, where you can get on TV and call for acts of violence against elected officials, basically. But that's what the United States was in 1967, 68, 69. That's not good law anymore. Since 9/11, we've had terrorism laws, right? And the terrorism laws that we have are extremely vague. Material aid to terrorism, promoting terror. In theory, right, someone like Charles Brandenburg might be able to theoretically get on TV and make that claim. But, if a Muslim imam got on TV and said, we acts of revenge, and then he would go to jail immediately. If a white supremacist got on TV, he would go to jail immediately. Charles Brandenburg was a white supremacist, and I think he did. He would. Nowadays, that's not good law. Why? Because the USA is less stable. It's less stable. And thank you, IO. I appreciate the super chat. The USA is less stable. There's more instability in the country, and so it's necessary to regulate things. It is a less stable country. But the Warren Court, the Warren Supreme Court, was probably the height of civil liberties in the United States. No society had ever had that level of freedom before. But the USA had a booming economy at that point, and things have drastically changed. drastically changed. And now with their anti-terrorism laws, and now with the surveillance state, and the way that people get disappeared, they operated a black site. About Homan Square. Google Homan Square in Chicago. The Chicago police operated what they called a black site. What that was, so when you get arrested, this is interesting, you should know this, right? You hear black site, it sounds like something out of a horror movie or something, but it actually has a very technical meaning, okay? So, you should know what it is. So, a black site is this, right? When you get arrested, you get handcuffed, and then they take you to jail. And it is public record that you are being held at that jail. You go from the arrest to the jail. But if you go to a black site, there's no record of where you are. No one can find you. Right? If you're in the jail, it's public record that you're in the jail. People will know that you're in the jail. People can find out if you're in the jail. But a black site is this weird purgatory between jail and arrest, where they arrest you and then you just kind of vanish. You just kind of vanish. And then 3 days later, you show up in the jail. And the Chicago police were doing this in Chicago. They were doing it to African Americans who were accused of being involved in gangs. They would get arrested, then they would be disappeared and taken to this place in Homan Square, and their families couldn't find them, and no one would know where they are, and they were handcuffed to the floor, and they were subject to conditions that people describe as torture. And then 3 days later, they'd be in jail, and they would be facing charges, or they'd be arraigned, or they'd be released. And then in 2012, yes, Red Illuminati, I'm getting to it, I know you were there. In 2012, they grabbed anti-NATO protesters, Occupy Wall Street protesters, including myself, went to Chicago in 2012 to protest against the NATO summit. And they raided one of the anarchist houses in Chicago. I mean, not where I was staying somewhere else, but they raided one of the anarchist houses in Chicago, and they took a whole bunch of protesters to the black site at Homan Square and held them there. One of them, who was held there, was actually ultimately acquitted of terrorism in court. The jury found him not guilty. He hadn't committed terrorism. That was pretty intense, folks. Now, they weren't doing that kind of thing in 1969. Now, there was, there was the COINTELPRO program, and they did murder Fred Hampton and such, but that wasn't routine. That kind of thing wasn't routine then. But in Chicago, for quite some time, operating a black site was routine. Why? Because the USA is becoming less stable. When societies are more prosperous and stable, people have more freedom. When societies are less prosperous and less stable, people don't have freedom. And the moralization of this, again, these anarchists really do believe, that freedom is a moral issue. Freedom is about morality. And it is not. That it's that whole, and this is, again, the anarchists are wrong, and Jordan Peterson and the right wing are wrong. And this is something that we must understand. This is what is so important about historical materialism. Okay? Historical materialism. Historical materialism has us understand that history is constantly in motion, and that the economic base of society gives birth to the superstructure, and that the political form, the kind of government you have, social relations, is rooted in the economic base. When we had hunter-gatherer civilization, Ulysses S Grant, when we had hunter-gatherer civilization, as a result of that, we had political forms that matched it. We had tribalism, tribal communalism, tribes. When we developed slavery, in ancient Egypt, and Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, those were slave empires, slave societies, there were political forms that matched those societies. And when we moved to feudalism, there were political forms that matched feudalism. And now that we have capitalism, and thank you for the super chat, Andrew, I do appreciate it. Now that we have capitalism, We have political forms that match capitalism. And that's generally how these things work. And it's not an issue of moralizing the good society versus the bad society. No. It's the society that is prosperous enough and stable enough that it is enabled to have the luxury of having openness and such. And there's the society that is more authoritarian. And what Jordan Peterson doesn't understand is Jordan Peterson, he talks about the lobsters. The lobsters have hierarchy in their genes. Gaddafi, we're talking about Gaddafi. The lobsters, they have hierarchies. The lobsters do, and antidepressants work on lobsters, and so therefore hierarchies are just natural, And first of all, that's a ridiculous argument. It's a ridiculous argument for a couple reasons. Reason number one, it's ridiculous because that argument could be used to justify any hierarchy. Any hierarchy could be used to be justified by that. Well, slavery is okay. Look, the lobsters, some lobsters are better than others, right? The Nazi government, Hitler being the dictator, the lobsters, you could use that argument to justify any hierarchy. At that point, you're saying all hierarchies are okay. You're not just saying that the ones that happen to exist are okay. You're saying that is an argument that would apply to everything. So that's the first thing. And the second point is, yes, the point he's making is that it is in the human's DNA to have the ability to function in society and create hierarchies. That is true. That is true. It is also in human DNA to run. Did you know that? It is in your DNA to run. Humans naturally have the ability to run. But do you run all day long? Because I sure don't. I run when I need to, when I decide to. I have the ability to run, but I don't run all the time. And that's when it comes to hierarchies. Human beings have the ability to create hierarchies. And in some instances, again, when you're having hunter-gatherer civilization, when you're in the conditions of primitive scarcity and subsistence farming, it may be beneficial to have hierarchies. But as society becomes more prosperous and more developed, and there's a level of greater abundance in society, the ability to loosen those hierarchies emerges, and the ability to have a better level of equality and more freedom emerges. And just because we have the ability to have hierarchies doesn't mean we have to. Right? If the car had been invented and human beings still ran everywhere because that's just the way we do things, people would go, no, we can drive the car. Right? That, yes, when hierarchies are necessary, we have the ability to create them, but we also have the ability, as we get to a society that doesn't necessitate them, to move away from hierarchies. And this is what Peterson doesn't understand, and this is what anarchist types don't understand. Anarchist types say all hierarchy is evil, we must fight against it, it's a bad moral choice. Well, they're wrong. That's not materialism. Jordan Peterson says, well, hierarchies are just natural, the lobsters have them. Well, that's not materialism either. Materialism tells us that hierarchies and the nature of society and the state and social relations changes based on the economic base. That's how it works. I mean, occasionally someone will just send me a nasty super chat and, I ignore that. But for the most part, I answer them. But that was just someone throwing slime at me. But that's the point. That's the point. And that if you have historical materialism and the Marxist understanding called historical materialism, you can recognize why some societies are authoritarian, why some societies are not. You can recognize why throughout human history no one had thought of human rights and freedom until the 1400s in Europe. You can recognize why socialist countries in different conditions, there you go. Believe in moral truths and moral truths and you can recognize why these things happen. You can recognize this. Historical materialism is very vital. It's a very, very vital thing. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And that thinking about Venezuela and how they declare it a dictatorship, and thinking about, the Vosh delusion that somehow, there's going to be a socialism someday that's just so open and democratic enough that, that made me think about all of that. So I just wanted to get that out there. But the other thing was the last stream we did, someone asked me about Eugene Dennis. So I actually have a copy of his book, Ideas They Cannot Jail by Eugene Dennis. And it's a collection of speeches and articles that Eugene Dennis, gave, and this was at the time of McCarthyism. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party. William Z. Foster was the chairman. And they put out this book, Ideas They Cannot Jail. They put this book out. Did I miss a super chat here? Let me go back. Let me roll it back. Soup USA and mutual aid and charity. All right, we can talk about that. Mutual aid and charity. I thought it might be interesting, since we talked about Eugene Dennis and his role in the history of the Communist Party. I thought it might be interesting to actually see if there might be something in the book that would be worth discussing. So I'm going to turn to... It's an interesting book. There's all kinds of stuff in here. I think there's a speech for like Stalin's birthday in this book. But this section I want to read to you here. All right? This section here, I want to read to you something. So, in 1948, and this kind of relates to what we were talking about. In 1948, the Communist Party of the United States was put on trial for the crime of allegedly conspiring to overthrow the U.S. government. And Eugene Dennis, being a spokesperson for the Communist Party, he gave a summation to the jury. So I thought I might actually read to you from his summation to the jury. Right? So I'm just going to read to you. I'm going to read to you, this is from Eugene Dennis's summation to the jury. He said, "We communist leaders were ostensibly indicted for our principles. We were not indicted for reducing the size of Communist Party clubs, a matter not prescribed by statute. We were not indicted on charges of alleged perjury or alleged use of false passports. We were not indicted because some of us have changed our names or because some communists call each other by their first names. But the prosecution has tried to smuggle each extraneous charge into this trial because it is unable to bring any evidence or credible testimony of conspiracy to teach and advocate the duty and necessity to overthrow the United States government by force and violence. That is why they had to rely on this backdoor effort to create an atmosphere of mystery around our Communist Party. The jury might well draw some conclusions of its own from the prosecution's false witnesses who testified that they had covenanted with the prosecution for 30 pieces of silver, and from that time sought opportunity to betray their trade union brothers, their own blood relatives, and their family next door. They testified that they were employed by the FBI, which schooled them to ply their sordid trade of falsifications, provocations, and disruptions. They confessed, nay boasted, that they are without shame or scruple. Thus, the prosecution's false witnesses inadvertently proved the Marxist thesis that the end and means are interrelated and inseparable. They proved that the despicable conspiratorial methods adopted by the prosecution in its attempt to convict the defendants are as un-American as they are sinister. The fact is that the only conspiracy which has been proved in this trial is that to which the prosecution and the false witnesses are party. The bipartisan conspiracy to destroy the Bill of Rights and Peace. Right. Uprise against tyrannical government. Wrote it down. Yet the prosecution and its false witnesses have the unmitigated gall to tell you jurors that we communists who teach that the end justifies the means. It is true that some communists, concerned for their jobs, their liberty, and sometimes even their lives, do independently decide to conceal their names or otherwise exercise their constitutional right to maintain privacy with their political affiliations. This is no crime, but the jury should ask itself, what goes on in a country when such concealment becomes increasingly a necessity, not only for communists, but for non-communist progressives, trade unionists, and African Americans and professionals? Does this state of affairs not reveal the existence of an evil, reactionary political atmosphere in which growing numbers of Americans have had to take such measures of self-protection? How is this evil to be remedied? Will these conditions be eliminated by the prosecution's proposal not only to convict us defendants, but to outlaw the Communist Party, and by its implied program, and by that it's implied it's a program for introducing a more political repression into American life? We communist leaders disagree. We think the repressive measures are the surest way to crucify the Bill of Rights, to compel the organization of secret societies, and to force millions of people to walk carefully and look behind them before they speak. We say the only way to overcome such a police state atmosphere is to enforce the Bill of Rights and make sure that every American, Jew or Gentile, African American or white, native or foreign-born, communist or non-communist, is secure for economic, social, and political penalty for his beliefs, race, creed, or color. Regardless of how some communists may have sought to protect themselves against witch hunts and this Nazi-style punishment for guilt by association, the whole record in this trial proves that we defendants in our party fully, frankly, and proudly declare our views and aims. Right? All right, CFR. Resources. All right. Moreover, the 35 defense witnesses provided the jury with an opportunity to see a cross-section of the Communist Party membership. The contrast between these upstanding men and women, the prosecution Judas parade, cannot have escaped your notice. Probably most of you jurors never saw a real live communist before you came to Foley Square. Perhaps you were surprised to find the descendants of Daniel Boone, John and Priscilla Alden sharing leadership in our ranks with descendants of African American slaves. You must also have noted that just half of these witnesses were World War II veterans. The record shows that there are 15,000 such veterans in our relatively small Communist Party. Many of them, including 4 of the defendants, hold leading posts in the party. It cannot have escaped your notice that men and women, African American and white, and all national and religious origins and occupations, most of them workers and trade unionists, find their way to our Communist Party on the basis of their own experience and socialist convictions. That we distinguished and noble friends outside our ranks, and you jurors also learned, even though one of them, that great American Paul Robeson, was not able to do much more than say he knew the defendants and some of us as friends. One need not be either a communist or a communist sympathizer or a progressive or a trade unionist to recognize the difference between people with good or evil intent. One need not understand a single Marxist principle or agree with a single word ever written by Lenin to recognize the real conspiracy symbolized by the prosecution and its false witnesses, or to know that the defendants and the defense witnesses are women and men who are dedicated to serving the interests of the American people, African American and white, and seek to promote peace and democratic advance. Now let us go down to the prosecution's $64 question. Do any of the principles of Marxism-Leninism mean the duty and necessity to overthrow the United States government by force and violence? We defendants have proved that they do not. But what has the prosecution produced to substantiate its fabricated charge? Its main reliance is on what it refers to as the paraphernalia of conspiracy. This is what we plain-speaking communists call books. This is the classic literature of Marxism-Leninism, an indispensable part of modern mankind's knowledge, culture, scientific thought, and social advance. Before analyzing, if only in capsule form, the great liberating principles of scientific socialism dealt with in these classics, I would like to bring the jury's attention to several vital facts. Some of the classics put into the evidence by the prosecution have been circulating freely in this country for 10 years, some for 30 years, some for 50 years, some for over 100 years. The Communist Party has publicly promoted the publication, distribution, and study of most of them for 30 years, and not accepting 1944 and 1945 of the Communist Political Association. A special honor and symbol attached to these books, where the Marxist classics have been banned, free speech and free press have been banned. Where they have been put on trial, men and women have been put in concentration camps without trial. Where these books have been burned, human beings have been consumed in crematoria. These books are a sort of barometer of the political climate. It is known to the jury and written on record of this trial that these very Marxist-Leninist books were returned to free circulation by the people of Germany, Italy, France, and Japan when American, British, and Soviet soldiers came to liberate these lands from the Nazi and Mikado tyranny. Strange as it may seem, these are the books which the communist leaders have been confronted with in this court. The prosecution does not even claim that we wrote them. It does not even say we defendants quoted from them. It says merely that somebody recommended them as an outline as additional reading for future study. The prosecution professes to put in issue that we communist leaders understood these books to mean, but no body of thought, least of all scientific socialism, can possibly be tried in a court of law. No court or jury can determine what goes on inside of our heads or the beliefs of any of the defendants being tried. Nevertheless, we communist leaders have proved what the principles of Marxism-Leninism are, and what they are not. What does the record reveal about the principles for which we are indicted? Do they, for example, include the principle of dog eat dog, of each for himself, and the devil take the hindmost? No, those are the principles of free enterprise and of the imperialist war makers. What are the Marxist-Leninist principles to which we 11 defendants proudly declare our adherence and which we endeavor to apply in the interests of our party and our country? These principles are outlined in the testimony of the defense, especially in William Z. Foster's deposition. They are also stated in various ways in relation to a host of historical and social events and developments in the Communist Manifesto, the State and Revolution, the Foundations of Leninism, the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the chief Marxist-Leninist classics put into evidence by the prosecution. And the record establishes that the following principles of Marxism-Leninism. First, that the struggle between social classes, between exploiters and exploited, between capital and labor, has been and is the motor power, the moving force in the development of civilized society, regardless of the will or desires of men. Second, that the working class is the most progressive class in modern society. The class in league with the future, destined to rule the nation and free the peoples of the tyranny and oppression of vested capitalist interests from class and national oppression. Therefore, the working class is the grave digger of dying capitalism and the creator of a new society, socialism. Further, that neither evolutionary social progress nor revolutionary social change can be brought about by minorities, adventurous plots, or by palace revolutions. Basic social change, social revolution, can only be achieved when objective circumstances and the teaching of experience bring tens of millions of people to act together under the leadership of the working class in accordance with the majority will. Third, after the attainment of state power, the working class and its allies can maintain their rule only by establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, and by using the power of the new working class state, then the only legal constitutional state power, to smash the old state machinery of the exploiters of the old capitalist minority and to crush their counter-revolutionary resistance. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a working-class dictatorship against the exploiters. It is the rule of the majority of the people. It is democracy for the great masses of people. It must establish and consolidate socialism and will ultimately create a classless communist society. Fourth, that our Marxist-Leninist principles establish that some wars are just, liberating, and progressive, and should be supported, while other wars are imperialist and reactionary, unjust, and should be opposed, whether waged by one's own government or some other government. Fifth, that there is a brotherhood of all working people, whose common historic aim and interest in peace, national freedom, and social progress unite them against their common enemies in the spirit of working-class solidarity and internationalism. Sixth, that it is a principle of Marxism-Leninism that to fulfill its historic aim, the working class needs and creates a political party of a new type, a vanguard party, a party of socialism, which is guided by the science of Marxism-Leninism and champions the immediate and fundamental interests of the working class and all oppressed people. These Marxist-Leninist principles, set forth in the classics and in our testimony, sum up the fundamental truths distilled from American and world history and general working-class experience. They are different from what the Wall Street Journal frankly and approvingly calls the jungle principle of the Atlantic Pact. They have nothing in common with the principles of, say, the DuPonts, or the Rockefellers, or John Foster Dulles, or John Rankin, or the National Association of Manufacturers, or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Strange as it may seem to the jury, the prosecution has never openly and directly challenged our forward-thinking and scientific Marxist-Leninist principles, for which ostensibly we communist leaders have been indicted. Nor has the prosecution dared to challenge openly the historic goal of the working class, the eventual socialist reorganization of American society, which we communist leaders advocate. As we testified, socialism is the public ownership of the great banks, factories, utilities, mines, and railroads, and all productive resources, and the management of the nation's economy by the people's government, at whose head stands the working class with its communist vanguard. We defendants have testified that under socialism, as in the Soviet Union, there is no exploitation of the many by the few, no racial or national inequality, no religious persecution, and no fear of unemployments. Birthday gifts. All right. There is no economic or social basis for seeking to subjugate other nations and peoples. Hence, there is no reason or basis for a socialist state to pursue a foreign policy of aggression. Quite the contrary. We have further testified in our earnest belief that the strengthening of socialism in the country, where it has been established in the USSR, and the attainment of socialism in all countries will forever end the threat of reaction, fascism, and war, and so open up new, boundless opportunities for humanity's well-being and social progress. Whether or not any of you jurors agree, even in a small part, with what the communist leaders believe about socialism is not an issue here. Just when the American people will decide they want socialism, and how they will achieve it, is a question for the majority of our fellow citizens, for the working people, and for the future. However, the prosecution has professed to pose before you jurors a hypothetical theoretical question, namely, do we defendants believe that the socialist reorganization of American society can ever, at any time, or under any circumstances, be accomplished without the overthrow of the United States government by force and violence? In falsely answering this question, the prosecution has deliberately jumbled and sought to confuse the important difference between principles and ultimate aims on the one hand, and strategy and specific tactics required to apply these principles on the others. But as you learned from Foster's deposition and other defense evidence and testimony, we communist leaders teach and emphasize the realization of working class aims, the application of the principles of scientific socialism, necessitate the adoption of a definite strategy and flexible tactics in accordance with historic realities, in accord with time, place, and circumstances. Government Exhibit number 33, The Foundations of Leninism, deals extensively with this distinction in Chapter 7. What does this exhibit underscore in regard to what we Marxists mean by strategy and tactics? It tells us the real Marxists must first understand that they cannot accomplish their socialist aims by wishful thinking. They must study what is going on in each particular country and each historic period and in each stage of a country's political life, including what's what in the working class movement. They must know what the grievances and aspirations that stir the millions of common people to action at each given time and place. They must know how to identify the main enemy of progress, the danger to peace, at each particular stage of events. They must shape their policies and set their course in accord with objective reality and the will of the majority of the workers and the common people. That is why we defendants teach Marxist-Leninist strategy. It must be clear to the jurors that there is nothing in any of these teachings to substantiate the prosecution's false charge that because we communist leaders are Marxists, we advocate the duty and necessity of the forcible overthrow of some hypothetical future U.S. government as the only means to achieve the ultimate goal of the working class socialism. How has the prosecution tried to prop up its monstrous, fantastical charge? It has parroted the undeniable fact that this is the law of inevitable proletarian revolution. The prosecution has borrowed a leaf from Hitler's Mein Kampf in an effort to make it appear that this law says socialism cannot be peacefully achieved, and that we communist leaders have a blueprint for when and how to bring about the forcible overthrow of the government. The law of inevitable proletarian revolution was and is a basic social law. It exists independent of the intent of defendants, any other Marxists, or the atomic fission, just as atomic fission exists independent of the will of nuclear physicists. This law of social change and revolution says socialism will ultimately be established in every country, but it does not say when or how. We communist leaders have proved what scarcely needed proving, that reactionary classes or minority cliques in power have used force and violence to block all progress wherever they were able to do so. A very striking recent example of this was the warning that even the mildest social measures to meet the needs of the people would be met by violent counter-revolution, which was voiced and advocated by John Foster Dulles in the New York Times. We defendants are proud that Marxists have, for 101 years, used their understanding of the laws of human history to advance social progress, to defend immediate as well as future interests of the working people. Everywhere in the world, force and violence are the instruments of monopoly rule, especially in its drive toward fascism. And in every time and place, the piously professed abhorrence of violence has been a hypocritical disguise adopted by reactionary vested interests, by those who oppose anything and everything that people may do to promote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To this rule, the Foley Square trial is no exception. So there you go. And he explains in great detail how the Communist Party never advocated the overthrow of the government through violence. And he goes on for pages explaining this. I could keep reading. I would be reading it to you all night. It's a very well-written speech that he gave to the jury. Very, very well written. And he talks about the Russian Revolution and how the Bolsheviks didn't want to have a violent revolution. It was forced on them. He talks about the Chinese Revolution and how it was, again, forced on them. And he talks about, the United States and what they advocate. He talks about how Abraham Lincoln was forced to have a violent revolution against the slaveholders. And he talks about the American Civil War. He talks about early American Marxists, and he talks about everything. And he quotes from Stalin, and he quotes, this is like really some intense stuff. He talks about why the Communist Party first opposed World War II and then changed their position. And how the Communist Party's position on World War II changed. And this is, if you really want, you have to understand that, that in the 1930s, Eugene Dennis was a leader of a party that represented millions of people, okay? There were millions of people that were in labor unions controlled by the Communist Party, that were in unemployment councils controlled by the Communist Party, that to actually be a member of the party was very demanding, so it was only, in the tens of thousands, the membership, but they represented literally millions of Americans, okay? There were millions of Americans that were under their leadership in labor unions, under their leadership in unemployment councils. I mean, it was an organization that represented millions of people, and so because they were not just silly people LARPing on the internet, because of that, they were held to higher political standards. They had to speak with clarity about what they believed, right? They had to speak in very clear language. He's explaining here what Marxism, Leninism actually means. He's explaining here what they actually believe. I mean, and he goes in. I mean, this is serious stuff. This is what a serious communist leader sounds like, right? This is the kind of stuff you should be reading. If you're seriously interested in building a socialist movement, this is what you should be listening to. Don't listen to some silly person who has a mohawk and waves their gun around on YouTube. Don't listen to some anarcho-Maoist on the internet. Don't listen to some Jabba the Vosh or, somebody who rejects all existing socialist countries. If you want to know what serious communist leaders sound like, if you want to know what they sounded like, check this out, right? Read Eugene Dennis, read William Z. Foster, read Gus Hall. Read the Black Panthers, read their writings, read about how they discussed these issues. Okay, that's what I recommend you do. I could keep reading that all night because it's just great. I mean, look at all the points he's making about what Marxism, Leninism is, and so many good things. So that's, I think there's got to be a PDF of this book available somewhere. But yeah, this is William Z. Foster, Gus Hall, Eugene Dennis, Huey Newton, Paul Robeson. These folks were serious, all right, and they talked like serious worker politicians. I like that phrase, worker politicians, because part of what communists do is they encourage working people to enter politics on their own accord. And so when working people engage in politics, they are worker politicians. And I like that. Worker-politicians. That's something we need. We need worker politicians. We need ordinary working people who understand that they are workers and have a socialist, anti-imperialist consciousness to enter politics on their own accord. We need worker politicians. I consider myself to be a worker politician, and I hope that you will become a worker politician, right? And that's my hope, right? And that a worker politician, that is what we need more of in this country at this time. So I just wanted to give you a little blast from the past. And on that note, folks, names and locations, I'll call you out as I see you, and then we'll start hammering out the super chats. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Emma from Ontario, Cleveland Pirate Alex, Chaya from Montreal, Dementia, Alan in Chicago, Detroit, Wisconsin, Io in New York, shout out to you, President Jesus in LA, John Whitty in Houston, Seattle, Ontario, Melody from Boston, Christian from Northern Zombieland, Robert from Hawaii, Zach B. from Richmond, Virginia, David from China, Ben in Chicago, Micah from Las Vegas, Tulare, California, Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn, Andy from New Zealand, Ash in Chicago, Enoch, Australia, Don D. in NYC, Redneck, West Virginia, Ryan from Oakland, shout out to you, Patty and Joshua Tree, shout out to you, Patrick from Rhode Island, shout out to you, Rice from Adelaide, Australia, Zach in Seattle, Foster in Kentucky, Los Angeles, Pyromaniac, Calvin from Saskatoon, Temple City, Troy, New York, Richard from Tacoma, Nate from the Bronx, Vinicius from Brazil, On the Shoulders of Giants, Utah, Baltimore, AOC, Finn in Duluth, Minnesota, Mel in Bobby and Mel in Austin, Cordoba, Argentina, David Rennie, Hamilton, Ontario, Grant, Duluth, Minnesota, Calgary, Canada. There you go. Ukiah, California, Auckland, New Zealand, Northern Michigan, Florida, Los Angeles, Finn in Duluth, Minnesota, Fairfax Station, Philippines, Brian Schaefer in Illinois. Crying Canada. Alrighty. Alrighty. Naples, Florida. Riverside, California. Matthias from Miami. Shout out to you. Shout out to you. All right, folks. So the first question I've got here. Jose from Caracas. Jeff in Ontario. First question I've got here is, why are past debates among socialists relevant? They're relevant because of the fact that we still have these same kind of debates. And we still see these same arguments out there. One very common mistake is you'll hear people say, I want things to get bad. This is a really common argument. You'll hear people say, well, I want things to get bad. That way we have a revolution. Right? People have been saying that for years. That I want things to get worse. That way we can have a revolution. Well, what we've learned through the history of the socialist movement is that things getting bad does not cause a revolution. In fact, things getting bad tends to demoralize people. What causes a revolution is things getting bad, but people resisting and people learning their own strength and building mobilizations to resist. And things getting bad, but people realizing they have the ability to resist and to counter it. And they have the ability to eventually build their own structures so that things aren't bad. And their own structures replace the structures of the old society. Well, I mean, that's a debate. But nowadays, I still hear people say, oh, I want things to get bad because that'll lead to, and it's like, no, it won't. No, it won't. Like, other arguments you hear people make, right? Another very common argument, you'll hear people make it. Well, I don't know. I mean, I could go over all of them, but these arguments are still around. These debates still take place, and that's why it's important. If you don't know this history, if you don't know, if you're a biologist, you have to know about Gregor Mendel. You have to know about Charles Darwin before you do modern biology. Well, Marxists are scientists. They're engaged in the science of history. And because of that, because they are scientists and they're engaged in the science of history, because of that, it is necessary for them to learn about the science that came beforehand. I mean, it's that simple. All right. How did Stalin come to power in Russia? Stalin came to power because after the death of Lenin, there was a three-way split in the Soviet Communist Party. There was the Trotskyites, the left opposition, and they advocated permanent revolution. And they wanted, the USSR to be, spreading communism all over the world. And, that it should act simply as, kind of a temporary holdout in a global struggle to seize the West because the West is all that matters. Then there was the right opposition, the Bukharinites. And the Bukharinites said the Soviet Union was too poor to have socialism, so they should just cultivate Western investment and maintain Lenin's new economic policy indefinitely. And that was led by Bukharin. And Stalin had the third position. And the third position, economic centralization. Power centralization. Stalin had the third position. And the third position was they needed to use 5-year plans to build up the economy. And that was the idea, right? He called it socialism in one country. So First, Trotsky was defeated. The left opposition of Trotsky was defeated. And then the Bukharinite right opposition was defeated, and Stalin triumphed. And it was 1928 was the year that Stalin triumphed. 1928 was a turning point in the global communist movement. Really 1927, but 28 is when it got solidified that first the Trotskyites had been defeated, then the Bukharinites had been defeated, and then 1928 you had the Sixth World Congress of the Communist International. The slogan was class against class, and they declared, that they had entered the third period, and that is the time in which it is considered that Stalin was the undisputed leader of the Soviet Communist Party. At that point, that was the ascendancy of Stalin. At that point, Stalin was considered his political line. Stalin's political line was the line of the Soviet Communist Party. After Bukharin was defeated, after Trotsky was defeated. All right. I've heard you will not disavow anti-imperialists. Well, look, I will disagree with anti-imperialists for the most part. I mean, there's people who are anti-imperialists that I disagree with. But what does disavow mean, right? I view disavowing as a cowardly, bad thing to do, right? I'll give you a great example. This is not in any way related to politics. Well, maybe, but years ago, when I was a student at school. There was a friend of mine who got in some trouble. And he got in some trouble at school. It was, he made a statement. He made a statement. He made some gestures that somebody conceived to be a threat. And he was in some trouble at school. And it was, he made a mistake or whatever. But I remember this friend of mine got in some trouble. And at first it looked like it was going to be really bad. And then it wasn't. So one day I was walking into math class. And this friend of mine who'd gotten in trouble, everyone knew about it. Small town, everyone knows. Small town, small school, everybody knows about it. I'm walking into math class, and the brother of this friend of mine that I knew was also walking into the math class. Now, this guy is the brother of my friend who's gotten in trouble. Right? I think he was half brother. I think they didn't have the same father. But, they were the half brother of my friend of mine who's gotten in trouble. But he's his brother. So he walks into class after his brother has gotten in so much trouble, and he proceeds to start making jokes, about, and starts laughing like, my brother's, oh my God, and I heard that and I was just inflamed because I thought, okay, it's one thing, this friend of mine has, had some trouble, maybe made a bad decision, but it was kind of blown out of proportion. But it's like, you're his brother. You should naturally have some loyalty to him, right? I mean, he's your blood relative. And, he's in trouble or whatever. And you shouldn't be making jokes about the fact that your brother is in this situation. Even if you think your brother's wrong, and you can say that. You can say, well, he did something he shouldn't have done or whatever. But you don't, and I saw that, and I thought this guy I thought he is really a low, despicable person because he has no loyalty to his own brother. I have a brother. And, he obviously doesn't agree with me on a lot of things. But, if he were to be facing difficulties, I wouldn't go around joking about it. I would hope that it could be resolved somehow. I would hope that there could be the best possible outcome, and I assume he would do the same for me. And that, that having loyalty to somebody else, despite whatever disagreements you might have, is an admirable quality. But throwing somebody under the bus is not an admirable quality. Betraying somebody is not an admirable quality. And it's like, especially when we're up against the imperialists, right? And that anybody who goes up against these imperialists, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, Russia, China, black nationalists in the United States, anti-war activists in the United States, the labor movement, anybody who goes up against the imperialists is going to face an onslaught. And I just feel that we have a duty to, and that doesn't mean we can't say we disagree. We do. There's a lot of anti-imperialists who say things I don't agree with, and I have the right. I maintain there's nothing wrong with saying that. I mean, it can be, there's no need to be excessive about it, right? It's a matter of emphasis, right? And it's a matter of time and place, etc. But for the most part, it's just, for the most part, no. I mean, it's one thing to say, you know what, Cuba has this policy, I don't agree with that. Fine. You know what, Minister Farrakhan, he said this, I don't agree with that. Fine. But when you get up and make a show of, I disavow, I have no association with, that's a despicable thing to do. Especially if it's someone the imperialists are coming after. And those are my values, right? That when the biggest mass murderers in the world are going after somebody, you can disagree with them, but at the end of the day, you have to You have to be on their side, right? I mean, an analogy, and this isn't the best analogy, honestly, but it's an analogy I've heard used many times. They said, okay, so imagine you were in the South of the United States, and there was a lynch mob assembling to go after a black man. Would you ask what that black man's religion was? Would you ask what that black man's life history was before you tried to help him and tried to get him away from the lynch mob? Well, if you're a moral, ethical person, you wouldn't. If you're a moral, ethical person, you'd realize the lynch mob was wrong, and, the other stuff, yeah, if somebody asked you, hey, this black man who is being targeted by the lynch mob, he's he's a Presbyterian and you're a Methodist. Well, that might be true, but doesn't matter. This black man, he mistreated his wife. Okay, that might be true, but that's not the issue here. The issue is there's a lynch mob forming, and they're about to commit a horrendous crime, and you have the ability to stop it, and are you going to do it or not? That's the issue, right? And that's the issue with Venezuela. That's the issue with Iran. That's the issue with Cuba. Is it, when the greatest mass murderers in this world are getting ready to unleash their violence and terror on a country, when they're ready to bring down the hammer of state repression, when they're mobilizing, the public to hate, these countries, it's like, okay, we can be honest about what's going on. There's no reason to pretend, to lie. But at the same time, you have to be real about who the greatest mass murderers are and why they're being targeted, and that's that. I mean, that's the issue. And you either get it or you don't. Some people just can't get this. They just, for the life of them, can't wrap their minds around this. They just can't. And what it really gets down to is you learn this in the struggle. You learn this by doing actual political work. When this is just, a hypothetical conversation where everything's a matter of opinion and all of that, well, at that point, you can have hypothetical discussions. But when you're actually doing real political work, if you're a worker on strike, if someone's facing, if there's a prisoner who's, facing being locked up and you're trying to get them free, you realize that there is a primary contradiction and there are secondary contradictions. And the primary contradiction is the issue at hand. And then there are secondary contradictions. And, when there is a primary contradiction, that becomes the focus. And that's why when there is an anti-imperialist who is being targeted by the imperialists, I realize what the primary contradiction is. And I don't focus on the secondary contradictions. And I also don't have respect for people who throw other people under the bus. I think it's a cowardly thing to do. To be, to stab somebody in the back, especially somebody who agrees with you, especially with someone who's on the same side as you, right? If you're sucking up to the enemy by trying to, win credibility. Thank you, Adam M. I don't view that as an honest, good thing to do. I don't. I mean, I just, and when people go, I disavow, I apologize for ever pretending I knew this person. You lose a lot of respect points in my eyes if you do that. Right? If you say, hey, this guy, he's a good anti-imperialist, but I disagree with him on that, fine. But when you get up and make a big show, when you virtue signal to the pro-imperialist people that it's not a good look. Not a good look. It's not to say I haven't made mistakes in my life. There were times in the past where I, as I was politically developing, I made those mistakes, and I've learned from it. Right? I've learned from it. It's kind of like what I was saying in my opening remarks about Venezuela. There will never be a socialism the New York Times will approve of. So, I mean, if you're trying to win credibility by disavowing somebody or whatever, good luck. Good luck. Alrighty, Gaddafi on democracy. Well, if you go read the Green Book, Gaddafi emphasizes that democracy is best defined, by the participation of the people, right? That voting, the idea that, well, everyone gets to vote, therefore it's a democracy. Well, no, right? The democracy means people are involved in the decision-making process, right? And that's Gaddafi in his, in the Green Book, there's 3 chapters. Chapter 1 is called Democracy. He emphasizes these popular committees that they had in Libya. They were like Soviets, basically, where people participated in running Libya. And by involving the people in the decision-making process, Libya was very democratic in that sense, right? So there you go. All right. Ulysses S. Grant. Well, Ulysses S. Grant, he was the president of the United States. He had been a general in the U.S. Civil War, and he had turned the tide of the Civil War. General McClellan was kind of losing the Civil War, but Ulysses S. Grant, he took the helm and he led the U.S. Civil War. And the autobiography of Ulysses S. Grant is very good. If you have a chance to go read the autobiography of Ulysses S. Grant, it is very good. He speaks in a very frank way. It's not a very formal autobiography. He has this candor. It's like he's talking to you, right? It's like he's just talking. It's like, I went here and I did this and I didn't like that. And he speaks with like a level of honesty. It's not the way you would expect a book written in that time. It's much more like he's talking to you. The autobiography of Ulysses S. Grant is very good. Ulysses S. Grant, I mean, he wasn't a communist. He wasn't a socialist, but he was very, very, very opposed to slavery. Very opposed to slavery. And he fought in the Mexican-American War, and he writes pages about what an evil, unjust war that was, how much he regretted fighting in it. It was the most unjust war ever fought. Then, he was part of the Civil War, and he turned the tide by making him in charge of the Union Army. He won the Civil War. He was so popular that he ran for president. And when he was president, he sent the U.S. military to Tennessee to fight the Ku Klux Klan, the Ku Klux Klan Act. He sent, the U.S. military to fight the Klan. And Ulysses S. Grant, and this is very interesting, was, for a president of the United States at that time, was somewhat sympathetic to Native Americans, which is, that's saying a lot, because that was not the prevailing opinion. But he took measures to restrain attacks on Native Americans, and he made a point, like there were many attempts by the U.S. Congress and others to violate treaties and stuff, and he was constantly being accused of being like an Indian lover, because he was constantly trying to stop atrocities and protect the rights of indigenous people. So Ulysses S. Grant was, as far as U.S. presidents go, he was a good one. Now, he was still bad in a lot of ways, right? I believe he, at one point, because of his marriage, he married a woman, and that woman had a relative who died, and so for like half a second, he owned a slave or something. Well, that's obviously, I don't approve of slave ownership in any sense. I think also that Ulysses S. Grant, I believe he was an alcoholic. I believe he may have been, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think he beat his wife, didn't he? Like he would beat his wife up or something. And so he may have not been a very good man in terms of moral life. But as far as U.S. presidents are concerned, he was one of the better ones, because it was coming out of the Civil War, which was the Second American Revolution. He had been the leader of the military during the Second American Revolution, and the U.S. Army played a progressive role in the U.S. Civil War. They overturned the slave plantation system of the South. Harriet Tubman became the first woman to ever lead U.S. soldiers into battle. There was even an entire section of the U.S. military that was led by Marxists, that was led by Joseph Wedemeyer, the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. They had like a whole Marxist division of the U.S. Army. So, for briefly, before the overturning of Reconstruction, there was land reform in the South. There was, there were attempts at slave reparations. And it was coming out of the Civil War, there was a progressive feeling in the air in the United States. And Ulysses S. Grant's presidency was kind of a manifestation of that. That said, I'm sure there were many things that he did throughout his life. I just named a few. You could argue that, he was problematic. But, I argue that we've really only had 2 presidents who were really good, which was Lincoln and Roosevelt. But, maybe we could throw Ulysses S. Grant is he wasn't Lincoln, right? Lincoln was an amazing leader. I mean, what Lincoln pulled off was, I mean, you have to remember Lincoln was probably one of the greatest politicians of that era by far. And he was a populist, and he led a coalition that stood up to the slaveholders and ultimately defeated the slaveholders. And, Roosevelt, also was a different kind of, Roosevelt led a coalition, a popular front, to beat back fascist coups and beat fascism in alliance with the Soviet Union and China, and stood up to the British, and many times the British tried to kick him around, and he, and so, Roosevelt, you could argue, but, Ulysses S. Grant, there are very few U.S. presidents that I find appealing. I mean, since World War II, we haven't had any good presidents. I mean, especially early on, we had some awful presidents, but, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is an individual that I can respect on some level. He made a contribution, fighting the Ku Klux Klan, sticking up for Native Americans, and his military contributions during the Civil War were massive. He played a good role in many areas. Go read his autobiography. Go read the autobiography of Ulysses S. Grant. It's, and again, it's written in this I read it and I was kind of blown away by how frankly he speaks. It's just this candor. It's like, you read, especially in that time, you read really old autobiographies. It's like, my father was born in, and it's like not that at all. It's like he's like, I went here and I felt this way. Then I went here and I felt that way. Then I went here and I mean, it's just like it's like, this is a dude. He's a dude, right? He's a dude talking to you and telling you about it. You read his book and you feel like he's talking to you. And actually, his autobiography, interestingly enough, there were so many veterans of the Civil War who were unemployed. And so he wrote, it's kind of a beautiful story. He didn't even want to write an autobiography, but he realized that there were all these unemployed veterans who didn't have any money. And so he had this idea. He wrote his autobiography, and then veterans sold it, right? And so veterans went around selling it. And that was the idea, right? Because he was this president. He was wildly popular. He had, and he'd won the Civil War. So the unemployed veterans were sent throughout the country to make money selling his autobiography. And they went door to door selling his autobiography. And there's 2 volumes of it, I believe. It's like volume 1 and volume 2. And it's pretty good. It's been a while since I read it. I think I read it maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But it's a pretty good book. And, I mean, he just comes across as a very anti-slavery. And he's definitely a military guy. That's clear. Definitely a manly man. Definitely not many talk. It's like women kind of don't exist. That's one criticism of the book. It's like women are just kind of like, it's just, he went here and talked to this man. He went here and talked. I mean, it's like women are just kind of background noise. But that's how some men are, unfortunately. And that's not good, right? That's not good. But, especially back then when the society was much more patriarchal. It's just kind of, he was a military dude and he was in the army and he liked his liquor and he fought in this war and then he fought in that war and then he fought in that war, and that was Ulysses S. Grant. So there you go. I mean, yeah. So there you go. All right, next question. Communist Party USA, Rise and Fall. I wrote a whole book on it. Go read the book. I mean, I've got many streams where I talk about the history of the Communist Party. I mean, I've got a lecture I gave called Mao and American Socialists, where I talk about the CPUSA and its relationship with China and the Maoist movement that emerged from the CPUSA in the early 60s. And I talk about William Z. Foster is someone I greatly admire. I mean, I could talk, I mean, that's like such a broad question, CPUSA and its rise and fall. I mean, that's a big question. I will say, I know a lot of people in the Communist Party that I really like, and there's great people in the Communist Party, and I am not a member of the Communist Party. I have no desire to influence the Communist Party in any way, and I guess some of their reaction to me has disappointed me, because it seems like there are some people in the Communist Party who like me, and there are some people in the Communist Party who are terrified of me, who are utterly and completely terrified of me. And that's really sad, because I'm not a threat to you in any way. If you're in the Communist Party and you're watching this, I am not a threat to you in any way. I am not going to join your organization. I'm not trying to take over your organization. I'm just I'm just doing my thing. I'm building the think tank, the Center for Political Innovation, which is not a party. And I don't know why you're so scared of me, because I wish you well. I think the country needs a strong communist party. I can't say I agree with everything you've ever done, but I am not a threat to you. I'm not a danger to you, and yeah, I wish you well. So there you go. Their reaction to me has been, I mean, it's been unfortunate. I've heard different things, and I'm not part of what's going on here and there. And I just, I wish they could be better. And I wish they could, I wish they weren't so, I wish they weren't so, whatever. I don't know. Some people in the Communist Party get really scared of me, and that's unfortunate because I'm not trying to harm you in any way, not a threat to you in any way, and I wish you well. All right. Are moral truths and historical materialism, consistent? Well, if you want to get technical, right, in the most extreme interpretation of historical materialism and the most extreme interpretation of moral truths, they are not. However, there can be a mild interpretation of moral truths and a mild interpretation of historical materialism, in which they are. But moral truths would argue that there are some things that are moral in all circumstances, regardless. And an extreme interpretation of historical materialism would argue that that the world is constantly in a state of change. A does not equal A. Well, that's the thing. So if you take a very hard interpretation of moral truths, that would negate historical materialism. If you take a very hard interpretation of historical materialism, that would negate moral truths. However, one can be a more or less historical materialist, but argue that principles of right and wrong certainly exist. And that's where I'm at. Like I said, I do believe in God. I'm not a complete hard materialist. And I do think there are moral truths, but those moral truths certainly change based on circumstances. And that, it's not like it's not like there's a law that is absolutely true at all times. And if you don't follow, no, it's like there are certain values and principles that do prevail through the ages, I think. But obviously, how they're applied changes in different circumstances. And so there you go. That's where I'm at with all of that. What's the difference between mutual aid and charity? Well, charity is associated with condescension. Um, you know, Condescension is how charity is associated with. I think it's, condescension, right? The idea is someone's charitable. The idea is, well, I have more than you, and I'm out of the goodness of my heart giving you something, right? That charity often implies a feeling of superiority on the part of the person giving it. Whereas mutual aid is that I'm on the same level as you, and together we are helping each other, and that you help me and I help you, and it's not like I am the great giver and you are the receiver who owes me, right? And I think that's the idea. The reason they refer to mutual aid rather than charity is because charity brings with it that the person being charitable is good, the person receiving is yeah, there's like there's a hierarchy in charity, I guess, right? In charity, the person giving the charity is above the person receiving it. Whereas in mutual aid, it's I have, so we help each other, and I help you in this way, and you might help me in this way, and we're approaching each other as equals. I think that's the idea. And I think it's a good idea. I like that, right? I think that's a good way of approaching things. That there are some ways that charity can be very condescending, and that charity, and it's better to view it in terms of mutual aid, right? They say, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Right? We all hope that our life doesn't take a very negative turn, but it is possible that that we could all be in a situation where we have to depend on the mutual aid of other people. So we should not think of those that we help as being inferior to us. And, that's not a good mindset to have. We should think that, okay, this person's down on their luck and I'm in a position to help them. So I should. And maybe when I'm down on my luck, someone else can, there have been times in my life where I was down on my luck, sold my blood plasma, was struggling. But I got out of that situation, right? But now there are other people who happen to now be down on their luck, right? And I help them. Now, obviously, some people have more privilege than other people, and some people are more likely to be down on their luck, etc. But we shouldn't put a moral judgment on that, right? We should just recognize that all human beings are entitled to a decent life. So there you go. All righty. How do we rise against a tyrannical government? Well, the main thing is to put forward a program, right? If you want to challenge the society you live in, the government you put forward a concrete program that you believe in and advocate it and challenge your elected officials. Are you for this or are you against it? And don't let them beat around the bush and give you rhetoric and soft soap, as they call it. No, demand that they, are you for this or are you against it? And that's what the Center for Political Innovation does. We formulate policies. Policies that are implementable, like, our 4-point economic plan, mass mobilization to rebuild the country, public control of natural gas and oil and timber and coal and all natural resources, public control of banking, and an economic bill of rights. Those are 4 things. Are you for that or are you against it? Fusion City, right? This global united effort for fusion energy. The Sandino Zapata economic corridor. Those are 4 concrete things. 4 concrete things. Are you for them? Are you against it? That is the way to challenge power. Is lay out what you are for, rally people around what you are for, put forward a very clear thing, not a vague concept, but a very clear thing that you're for. Right? There you go. I mean, that's what I would advocate. Put forward a program. Right? How do you learn more about the Council on Foreign Relations? Well, I mean, if you want to know what they're thinking, go read Foreign Affairs magazine. That's the, public consumption. That's their opinion of world events. If you want to know about their history, go read The Anglo-American Establishment by Carroll Quigley. Carroll Quigley was a very important academic who was kind of a mentor to Bill Clinton, and he wrote a book called The Anglo-American Establishment, where he talks about these various institutions set up by the British that influence policy, and how, the United States, the real centers of power in the United States, is very much tied in with Britain, and that there is like a financial and political elite in the United States that's tied in with Britain, and it fights with other factions in the ruling class. And it's probably, the richest families in the United States tend to be tied in with Britain, and it's the Anglo-American Establishment. Go read The Anglo-American Establishment by Carroll Quigley. Next question. Birthday gift for kids who are 9 and 11. I have no idea. I do not have children. I do not intend to ever have children. I have no idea what you would give to a 9 or 11-year-old child for their birthday. Just not my field of expertise. I remember when I was a kid, it seemed like there was always a toy that was like in high demand, like Tickle Me Elmo, and I don't know, right? There, I don't know. I mean, right? Isn't that a thing, right? And then, right, and parents are worried about their kids having screen time, and kids don't like to get clothes. Well, some kids do. I think girls like to get clothes, but when I was a kid, I hated getting clothes. As a gift. When people would give me clothing, I would just be like, oh boy, I'm a kid. So don't get them clothing. Don't get them clothing. That I would oppose. But ultimately, when you give gifts to anybody, you have to know them. You have to know them, right? It's about the person, right? There's something you might give to somebody, and they're just like, oh, that's something, and you would give it to someone else, they'd love it, right? That the key to giving any gift is knowing that person intimately. One of the nicest things that anyone has ever done for me, that caused me the biggest amount of happiness, was a Facebook post someone made for me once. Didn't cost them a dime. It was a Facebook post someone made for me. I'm not even going to say who it was. But the person, as just kind of a joke, just kind of to be nice, they knew somebody that I was really interested in. They knew me well enough to know what I really passionately believed in and all of that. And they went out of their way to make a Facebook post for me that was very nice. It was one of the nicest things that anyone has ever done for me. And I think about it now. I'm trying not to get emotional. But this person, who actually is actually not even my friend anymore, which is kind of hilarious, but they had gone out of their way to get to know me well enough that they could make a Facebook post for me. This person is not a person who agrees with me politically, not a person who, but he and I were friends. Older man, we were working together, we were friends, and he went out of his way to make a post on Facebook. And that post told me that I know you, Caleb. I know you. I know what is important to you. I know what you like. And he made a beautiful post. And that means more to me. Someone could write me a check for all kinds of money, and that would be nice. I would appreciate it. But in terms of my emotional response to that post, I mean, it was that person, they hit the spot with me that day, and that shows that when someone really knows you, that's the secret to a really good gift. The secret to a really good gift is that it's not what you're giving the person. It's that you're using the gift to tell the person that I know you well enough. I know you well enough to know what you really want. And I'm going to give you this. And that is beautiful. If you can know somebody well enough to give them something that really means something specific, that is the ultimate gift. Is a gift that tells the person, I know you intimately. I know you intimately, and I know what you would want, and I've given it to you. So, and if you can give that to somebody, you are an amazing gift giver. You have won their heart. You have won their heart. If you can do that. And it's very hard to do. It is not an easy thing to do. It is a very hard thing to know someone well enough and then to be able to think of how I can communicate that with a gift. It's not an easy thing to do at all. It's a very hard thing to do. But if you can do that, if you can give a gift that shows that you know them, you have worked hard enough to really know who they are, and based on that, you have found a way to make them happy. That is very special. Wow. So there you go. There you go. That is my answer. And that's not just for 9 and 11 years. It's for anybody, right? If you can find out, if you can give a gift that shows you know them, that is the best gift you can give. All right. So there you go. Economic centralization equals power centralization. Well, yeah, right? And that's what we're seeing. Under capitalism, wealth is constantly centralizing in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And as a result of that, the power in society increasingly centralizes into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And that's capitalism. In fact, that's how the capitalist market functions, right? That's why, they have all kinds of apparatus set up to prevent monopolies, right? Karl Marx wrote about the general law of capitalist accumulation, that if a capitalist enterprise is not expanding, it dies, right? The capitalist, he makes profits, and then he takes those profits and reinvests them, expanding his enterprise so that he can make more profits. Then he takes those profits and he reinvests them, expands his enterprise to make more profits. Then he reinvests them. And if at any point the capitalist stops doing that, he goes out of business. And the businesses that survive keep expanding and getting bigger. And the businesses that don't, they go out of business. And so you're talking about economic centralization equals power centralization. You are 100% correct. And that is what capitalism does. But socialism is not economic centralization. Socialism is economic, it's spreading control of the economy out to the broad masses. It's giving the broad masses of people, society as a whole, control over the means of production. The banks, factories, and industries being organized to serve public good and not the profits of a small group of owners. Right? It's eliminating the anarchy of production, the chaos of production, and putting human reason and planning in control of the economy. and giving average people a say in how the economy is organized. It gives the broad masses the ability to influence economic decision making in a far more effective way than they do under this system. And it also it has the economy being forced not to simply do what is profitable for private owners, but it allows for rational human reason and planning. So the way the argument is being framed up, I think the person meant it as an honest question about, why would you want socialism? Wouldn't that lead to power centralizing? And I'm saying, no, this is an argument about capitalism. It's capitalism that leads to economic centralization and thus power centralization. It's socialism that leads to economic democratization and thus a broader level of democracy. I would argue that every socialist society, in one sense, is more democratic than the capitalist societies are. Because if you look at China, you look at Venezuela, you look at Cuba, those countries wouldn't be in power for a minute if they didn't have a well-organized population that, worked to carry out the government's goals on a local level. In Venezuela, they have Bolivarian circles in every neighborhood and community that mobilize the country. When the government wants to do something, it has to depend on those goals. So there you go. All right, space commune. Right. Our daily relationship to power. All right. Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the vice president. He was the secretary of agriculture, and he was kind of a progressive, kind of friendly to the Socialist Party. He was the vice president during World War II. He was very friendly to the Soviet Union. He was a friend of organized labor. And then in 1948, he broke with the Democrats. He formed the Progressive Party that ran against Harry Truman for the presidency. And he was a great person in many, many ways. A very, very, very progressive person, anti-imperialist. His campaign in 1948 was a very good campaign. It was anti-racist, anti-war, against McCarthyism, wanting to continue friendship with the Soviet Union. Yeah, Henry Wallace was largely good. Now, obviously one thing I don't agree with on, he was very pro-Israel. He was very, very pro-Israel. I'm not pro-Israel. So, there's room for criticism. But, I think, the role he played, especially after he was vice president, was a very good one. And that he was part of that Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party. During the Roosevelt years, you had the Popular Front, and you had a faction of the Democrats that was, sympathetic to the Soviet Union and sympathetic to organized labor and was thoroughly anti-fascist. And there was a wing of the Democratic Party under Roosevelt that was social democratic, I guess you could call it. And they were purged by the Democrats. McCarthyism started with the Democrats purging their own ranks. Then it turned into the Republicans attacking the Democrats. And then eventually it turned into like lower level businessmen trying to rally against big capital. And that's when Joe McCarthy was destroyed and humiliated on national TV. McCarthyism went through stages. First, it was a purge of the Communist Party's friends in the Democratic Party. Then it was Republicans against the Democrats. Then it was Joe McCarthy fanatically going after and then it was gotten rid of. So there you go. All right. The Space Commune. I did an interview with them. I did they seem to be, they kind of share, again, one of the biggest distortions in leftist circles is this belief that historical progress is bad, that economic growth is bad. That's a distortion. That's not Marxism. That's a big part of the synthetic left, right? And so I did a chat with them about Earth Day, and I think I've done some stuff with them about this. Again, the land back thing. I'll just say this, right? They move, the goalpost is constantly moving. So if land back means that indigenous people have the right to autonomy and their own territory and reparations, I'm for it. But if land back means this privatization of public lands program that Jeff Bezos is promoting, I'm not for it. If it's this trendy hashtag that all the liberals are promoting, I'm not for that. But if it means, autonomous I have always been clear. I take the communist position, the right to self-determination for all colonized people within the United States. Period. Right? Our daily relationship to power. Our daily relationship to power. That's a bizarre question, but there's many ways you could probably take that. But power exists, right? I mean, there are laws that we have to follow. There are rules in life, right? If you're in school, your teachers and authorities are going to tell you what to do, right? If you have an employer, your employer is going to tell you what to do. We live in a country where there are regulations. If you live in a household, right, when you're a child, your parents have authority over you, right? Power exists, right? And that people have authority over other people. And that this is that hierarchy thing, that I was talking about. That hierarchies, again, it's in our DNA. They're created out of necessity. But the hope is that we get to a society of vast material abundance. That's that ultimate goal of communism that Karl Marx writes about. A society with so much abundance where, read the Critique of the Goethe Program. Karl Marx explains what the ultimate goal of communism is. It's a world with so much wealth and prosperity that the need for any hierarchies or coercion can fade away. Labor becomes life's prime want. Um, you know, um, Labor becomes life's prime want. Rather than a necessity, meaning people only work because they feel like it. They don't have to, right? There is no division between mental and manual labor, right? When all of these things are broken down, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, right? And that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to build with central planning of the economy a society where there is so much abundance and prosperity that authority and hierarchies can gradually fade away, and people can just kind of do what they feel like doing and take what they need from each according to their own ability to each according to their needs. That is the ultimate goal, and it is based on material. It's not based on people just learning to be good. It's based on the level of economic development reaching the point that it can establish that, and that's what is missing. So there you go. All right. What was the super chat here? Give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. So that's in the Bible, right? That's Jesus Christ. I believe the story goes, if I'm the scripture, the story is that Jesus is being confronted by Pharisees, right? And they're trying to get Jesus in trouble because, if Jesus says don't pay taxes, then he would be arrested. So they say to him, is it wrong to pay taxes? And they're trying to get him, right? It's a gotcha question, right? Is it wrong to pay taxes? And he says, render unto Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and render unto God that which belongs to God. Well, that's an answer that is hard to decode, right? So it's like he never said don't pay your taxes, but he also said, obviously he's not saying treat Caesar as a god, right? And Caesar Augustus, who was the emperor of Rome at the time, did proclaim himself to be a god, but he's not calling Caesar a god, and he's saying don't give Caesar what's owed to God, and don't give to God what you owe to Caesar, right? And so he's making a differentiation between the head of state of the Roman Empire and God. He just, that was his answer. Should we pay our taxes? And he said, well, and he answered it in kind of a roundabout way. And they sat there and they went, oh, darn, God, we tried to get him and we couldn't get him that time. That's the way it was. And there's many in the New Testament, the Gospels, which are the accounts of the life of Jesus. There are many anecdotes like that, where the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the religious authorities at the time approach Jesus and they say, tell us this. And they want to get him to say something that'll get him in trouble. And he finds a way to answer it in a way that doesn't get him in trouble. And that's kind of, and it reminds you, what it reminds you of? It reminds you actually of the Oracle at Delphi, which was a big part of the ancient world. And I have a whole stream about the Oracle at Delphi and the role that they played. But the Oracle at Delphi was the same way. They would go to the Oracle at Delphi and they would ask the Oracle at Delphi, hey, Oracle at Delphi, should I go to war? And the Oracle at Delphi would say, if you go to war, you will destroy a great kingdom. And so he says, oh, great, I'm going to destroy a great kingdom. Well, it turns out the kingdom he's destroying is his own. Gotcha. right? And that the oracle at Delphi gives these kind of vague answers, right? So, maybe that's an example of Jesus Christ talking like the oracle at Delphi, right? And that was a big thing in the ancient world, that often, like, wisdom from people that were thought to be magical or divine was often very not, you know, not to the point. Do you recognize China's increasing authoritarianism? Well, compared to the Cultural Revolution, compared to the Mao era, China's much less authoritarian. I mean, I don't know. What do you mean increasing authoritarianism? I mean, I'm sorry, but it's like the way China was in the 70s during the Cultural Revolution, China's much less authoritarian. So, I mean, are they becoming more authoritarian in the current circumstance than they were for, like, maybe the past 10 years? Perhaps, and that's in response to the fact that they're facing bigger attack. The United States is all out after them. You go back 10, 20 years, China and the United States were best friends forever, kind of. Now, the United States is becoming more and more anti-China every day, and that's forcing the Chinese Communist Party to make sure that society is locked down and ready to be protected. The USA is right now trying to bait China into a situation where they feel they have to retake Taiwan, right? Again, China again is facing a bigger threat, and the USA wants to break apart China. It's sponsored those violent Hong Kong protests. It was almost like a war, right? It was almost like an insurgency the United States sponsored in Hong Kong, trying to break away part of China. And it didn't work, but it certainly was an all-out attack. They're trying to break away the Uyghur regions. They're trying to break away Tibet. They're trying to break away Taiwan. They're trying to provoke a situation where the mainland feels it has to militarily retake Taiwan. China is facing more hostility and aggression from the United States than it's faced in a long time. I mean, look, they held the Huawei chief financial officer. She was detained in Canada, like held, as a prisoner in house arrest in Canada for a couple of years until Canada finally made a deal, right? So, the USA basically, what they're doing to Alex Saab, they tried to do it to one of the most important leaders of one of the most important corporations in China right now. So you have to understand that that there is definitely, is China becoming, is power centralizing more? Sure, and they're preparing for a confrontation, and that's not good, right? A war with China will be a disaster. War with China will be a disaster. And I'll just say this, and I take it however you want to take it. But I'll tell you why a war with China will be a disaster. It'll be a disaster because China is a very big country, and a lot of people will die, and both the United States and China have nuclear weapons, so it'll be a disaster in that sense. But it's also going to be a disaster. If there was a war with China, it would be a disaster for another reason. And I'm just telling you this, okay? You can pretend you don't agree with me, but if you don't admit this, you're in la la land. A war with China would be a disaster for America. Why? They'll kick our ass. Right? I don't care. You can hate China all day. You can not care about the millions of people who die. But if the United States and China went to a war, China would kick our ass. I'm sorry. I'm a millennial. I know a lot of Zoomers. I love you guys. I see a lot of potential in you guys. Do you really think that if they draft all of us millennials and Zoomers and put guns in our hands and put us on a battlefield against the People's Republic of China, that we would have a chance in hell? I don't. I really don't. I'm sorry. If you're going to, an all-out war with China would require, you'd have to, like, conscript all the young American men and probably the women. Do you really think that the Zoomers, we're going to put guns in our hands and we're going to, really, and I'm just asking you. Just being honest with you. Look at the United States. Do you really think that the country, I don't know why any rational person would want a confrontation with China. Right? China doesn't want a confrontation with us. China does not seek to export its system. There's a lot of countries around the world that are aligned with China. They don't force the Chinese political system on them. In fact, China, I don't know any country in the world that has adopted the Chinese political system, right? I don't know any country. The social credit system is not what they say it is. I see your super chat there. You need to actually read about what it really is, because it barely exists. Like, the social credit system is largely because of the fact that, the Chinese government has no way of, when people break the law and get sentenced to pay fines, the Chinese government has no way to collect. And so the social credit system is a way they can, like, force people who've been convicted of crimes to pay their fines. Right? I mean, the social credit system, you have it in your head that everyone's being monitored with cameras and they get more points for this and less points for that. And that's not what it is at all. That's pure projection. That's a huge exaggeration, right? The social credit system is an attempt to, assert central authority by the Chinese Communist Party, because China is so regionally divided. South China and North China are not the same. Different regions of China have different agendas, and it's an attempt to try and motivate different regions to cooperate with the overall agenda of China. And it's a way that, like, the government can make sure that people pay their fines and stuff. So what you've heard about the social credit system is a huge projection. Not that there's, obviously there's room for criticism, but it's not what you've heard. And that said, folks, that is the end of our stream. That is the end of our stream tonight, because of the fact that we have run out of super chat questions. So on that note, we're going to end. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. The danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared. But revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. I don't know who that person is that you just mentioned, so I'd have to look into them. Good night, folks. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. Good night.